Wait, I gotta yawn. Okay. I'm not gonna have an intro. Intros are kind of a waste of everyone's time. This is just off the top of my head. I'm hoping to keep this video relatively short, but I did, figure for I guess the pre-study type vlog thing. It was pretty cool to just, I don't know, let my brain ramble a little bit, but hopefully try to keep it not too absurdly long. So a quick about me, because no one knows who I am. I'm a nobody. My name is Jace. Most people just call me Jay, right? 21 years old. I'm in like the Midwest area, and I work full time, 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, and so generally I don't have a lot of time. My experience with like wanting to learn languages is sorry, once again. Sorry. My experience with languages is basically wanting to learn Japanese at the age of like 15 because I really like anime, manga, and honestly, it's been more even then since I was young. I took traditional Japanese martial arts for a while, like karate, before moving into more MMA, but still having like a very strong foundation that I, kind of created during karate. Having to count and do drills in Japanese, just which I don't even know necessarily why we did that, but it was kind of sick. I'm not gonna lie. And then around a young age, I got into anime and manga. As you do, very young actually. I think I was around like 8. I got into it through I think Zatch Bell and Naruto, if I can remember properly. But from there, I ended up basically obsessing over it. I've watched an insane amount of anime, probably more than I think than anyone else I've ever met in my life. I'm almost like I'm at my 1,500s right now, and I'm definitely have declined in how much I've watched, especially since I've gotten busy. But being that inspired by so much Japanese stuff, I like JRPGs. That was another thing that I played a ton when I was young. I really wanted to get into Japanese, so I started studying, and quickly it just immediately fell apart. I was a dumb kid. I didn't know how to find resources. I was just trying to use like one site. I knew nothing. I did no research. The most research I did was just like learn Japanese, and I considered that research, I guess, at the time. And just after like one day, I was like, this sucks. So fast forward later, I took brief Korean lessons, I think for like 2 days. And it literally was, I learned half of Hangul, and then I just kind of gave up because I didn't care. After that, I tried learning Chinese, and I actually really, really enjoyed learning Chinese. I stuck with it for a little bit, and I really liked it. I think the Hanzi stuff is super sick. I really like the tones. I like pretty much everything about the language, honestly, and I thought it was really cool, especially when I was watching anime. One of the coolest things is when I'd see kanji, I could kind of know what it says, and a lot of things kind of made more sense. For example, if anyone's ever seen Death Note, when Misa Mane is using her Shinigami eyes and sees his name as Light Yagami, she thinks it's Moon Yagami because I think they use a kanji for moon, right? Like just small things like that. The English translation can't translate for you, and I think that just something small as that really, really made me get very interested in language and language learning. In the end, I ended up dropping Chinese just because I realized that most of my interest that came from Chinese was actually just interested in Japanese, and Chinese just was kind of like an alternative for me at the time because I had already failed studying Japanese. Then I picked up Spanish for just no particular reason. My workplace has a lot of Spanish-speaking people, and Spain is probably my favorite European country. And generally, I think it's like history is the most interesting too, and I just prefer Southern Europe as a whole. So I thought Spanish was pretty sick, but I ran across the same exact issue that I ran with Chinese, where actually even more so, where I didn't really care about the media. It was more so that I cared about the history and the language itself, but the things that would pull me to the language kind of weren't enough to saddle me to it. So I ended up giving up Spanish, and I basically decided, if I learn a language, it's going to be a language that I like actually really care about, regardless of how hard it is. I had already tried Japanese, and I knew for a fact that if I had studied Japanese in a better way, the way I'd studied Chinese in Spanish, while in doing research, with Anki, with having textbooks and also listening practice and all these different things, I knew for a fact that I could learn Japanese, but I still wasn't confident enough in the fact that I had a good method to learn language. So I basically just went out and I did research for honestly about a month, just going through pretty much every possible resource I could find for, kind of different methods for learning language, kind of looking at people who have certain results, kind of trying to parse through. It's definitely hard when a lot of people want to kind of sell you on a method of theirs. But generally, I think I've managed to cut through pretty well and create a very impressive, in my opinion, study routine that kind of throws together every fundamental principle I've learned and I had applied since starting to learn Spanish and Chinese and kind of dabbling in a bunch of other languages and kind of peeking my head through. I feel like I developed a lot better fundamental understanding of how to learn a language, and thus I felt confident enough to step within the realm of learning a language that highly interests me, regardless of its difficulty. Gross. Enter Korean. Korea itself being a country that I always paralleled with Japan and being one of my favorite countries ever in terms of cultural exports. Getting into it, I think I got into it when I was around 13, 14. It was around the time that EXO had debuted, and I saw their, I think, Mama music video, and I thought it was super sick. I actually only found out about it because I had at the time, a girlfriend, 13, who thought it looked interesting. And she was super into K-pop, and she had never heard of EXO before. So I ended up checking it out. Funnily enough, I actually think that I was late to that music video by like a year. Both of us were. I think we found that out later. Well, pretty cool. After that, I got interested, but it wasn't really necessarily K-pop that drove me to it. I thought Korea in general just seemed really cool. I also am very interested in esports. I've played a lot of games to almost pretty decent levels. I won't say like professional, but at least tournament competent, and I guess relatively high performing in a lot of different games. And then other games I'm kind of like mid at, but I think I have a good competitive understanding of it. And then other games I am a scrub, but I subscribe to competitive scenes. Korea being as dominant as they were in so many esports, especially ones that interested me, like Overwatch and League of Legends, I thought that was so sick. And generally, I'd also come from my favorite genre of competitive games being fighting games where Japan dominates hard, and seeing Korea contend with Japan and Tekken I thought was awesome. I thought that was really interesting. In general, I just think Korea is a cool country, and I guess from an outsider's perspective, we'll see how accurate I am. My perceptions of Korea currently are very much that obviously they have similarities to Japan, but it seems more, I don't want to say necessarily Western pandering, but it seems more so that Korea's, I guess, importing of Western culture has resulted into a greater, a less level of, there's less of a barrier, I guess, between their absorption of that culture and their identity than I think there is with Japan. I think Japan is incredible at taking other things and making them fundamentally Japanese and applying it to their cultural exports. Well, I think Korea, it feels more so that they're willing to play more into and accept, and I guess I don't want to say cater, but they don't have that huge level of separation. And I think K-rap is a good example of it. In general, I think that their media feels like a weird area between Japan and the Western world. If Japan is right here and the Western world's right here, Korea is about like right here, right? And at least it's more accessible in that way. Generally, I live in an area that's surrounded by a lot of Korean Americans and Korean immigrants as well, and my experiences with them have always been funny. And just talking to them, especially having a few of them as my friend, I got a lot of insight, I think, on the culture of Korea and things related to Korea, and it was very interesting to me. And then also through one of my friends, I met a girl who actually lived in Korea and was taking a vacation here. She actually came twice, and I hung out with her I believe both times. Honestly, it was so long ago. And I thought the things that I got to talk to her about were insanely interesting too, especially because her views of Korea kind of were against the grain. In general, consuming Korean content over the course of time, I actually probably read more manhwa, webtoons, and read more web novels of Korea than I read manga in Japan, despite manga being the thing I usually think of when I think of the literature that I read. And also on top of that, I do enjoy Korean music. I'm very picky on rap music, and I enjoy Korean rap. And I also think the culture of Korea is very interesting. Obviously, I'm not subscribed to all of it. There's some things that I think just inherently being an American sort of makes you go, I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I think that's good. I think cultures vary in different ways, and I think it's good to be able to accept that maybe some things won't jive with you while also not necessarily looking down upon it. I think people too commonly look at both culture and language from a perspective of an outsider from a Western world and how much they can assimilate it within their lives, rather than thinking consciously about the differences and why they've sort of developed. I think people can sometimes lose respect just because of difference. But I guess that's like a side tangent. I don't want to get into that. So my time basically came to study Korean when I had finally finished my study routine. I had basically found all the resources I need, and I had decided I'm going to learn Korean. And not only am I going to learn Korean, I'm going to dedicate myself to it to an insane degree. So much so that I started following a lot of people who I thought made very interesting content related to studying Japanese. Matt versus Japan, Dogen, Learn Japanese from Zero, learning about Japanese perspectives on a lot of language things like, Japanese Man Yuta. I follow a podcast with the Anime Man, obviously, who famously also speaks Japanese. So I think I just had a stroke and I just completely trailed off my thoughts. And looking at the kind of way these people study Japanese, I also have a lot of friends who are bilingual or trilingual, most of which actually within Asian languages. I guess they just occupy the friend groups that I'm in. I had them look over it. I got a lot of their advice on kind of the way I should develop it. And generally, after getting a lot of this input, I really believe strongly that I came up with something that I had confidence that I could achieve Korean fluency pretty much as fast as humanly possible for someone like me. And I think it works well with a lot of the past successes and past failed experiences I've had coming to studying other languages. I don't want to get too much into study routine, mostly because study routine is something that I'm going to reserve to another video, likely when I talk about actually studying, which will start in a week. I don't know, though. I might go over it later when I recap, my progress in the past. I'm not really sure, but either way, the purpose of me talking about it here is kind of talking about the anticipation of, I guess, Korea changing my life and Korean changing my life, especially in the way of how my study methods are as intensive as they are. Generally, I think it's kind of scary, to be honest, to be able to have to step into something where you direct your attention to something so much where you have to make sort of personal life sacrifices to do so. Despite that, I take a drink. Despite that, I have to emphasize that I truly do have this much motivation and this much interest within Korea as a language, as a culture, and as something to attain. Korean is something that I value within my future, and especially recently, the more and more I'd kind of done research and even dabbled a little within studying. Now my waking moments all consist of, I want to learn Korean. I want to learn Korean. Why am I doing this? I could be learning Korean. Why am I doing that? I could be learning Korean. And it's gotten to the point where it's pretty ridiculous. And I think that's when I realized, well, if I have this much motivation, I ought to put myself something pretty crazy. And so I have essentially my studies into Korean specifically will involve a lot of immersion and just generally a lot of time spent. Essentially, I'm not only just studying Korean, I'm immersing myself entirely. And by doing that, cutting myself off from the entire Western media that I sort of consume almost completely. It's something I've wanted to do. In general, I can make an entire video about how I feel the internet generally has degraded our self-independence and has kind of gotten us to this centralized idea that we must consume the same sort of content day in and day out with no variation to our schedule, and all interests that we find being within the confined bubbles of whatever sites we use. And generally, I also think it's very easy to get sucked into a repetitive, one-note perspective when you consume the same media that perpetuates the same ideas or same perspectives on whatever ideas continually and continually. In that way, I also generally think the internet is not something to be valued, I think, in the way that it is valued within my life currently. And I think I've had an issue previously in the past in general with trying to replace a lot of real-life aspects of my life with the internet. And in general, I think this is an important step, both on myself and also I think for the way that I interact with the world in the future. I think it's an important step to sort of rid myself of a lot of those things. And I figured this is just a good opportunity to do so. But it gets more interesting. Speaking now, my friend is also studying with me. And essentially we're working off a very similar course, almost identically, though he is actually not learning Korean. He's learning Japanese. He's actually started his studies a week earlier than me because I had actually messed up in starting mine. I didn't have everything I needed. Thanks, Amazon. And so we both, starting tomorrow, will be entering an intensive immersive study of the two, hardest languages for an English speaker to speak, according to some people. Not everyone. I know that's a hotly debated topic. With that, I guess I just kind of wanted to make this video as something to look back on and kind of look at myself. And once I had reached whatever perspective, whether good or bad, when I'm at the top of the mountain, I can look at my past self and kind of ponder and think to myself, who was I then, and what's changed about me now? What have I learned, and sort of was it worth it? But starting from this moment on, or from this day on, basically, I guess all my time will be spent consuming this language, studying hard, reviewing everything, constantly, pursuing of as close as I can get to perfection. I have no interest in letting Korean be something that lies to my wayside. I have interest in making it something that I continually work on for the rest of my life. Whether or not it's intensive study, obviously at some point I'm going to ease up, but only when I'm at the point where I feel that my improvement in Korean can only come through interacting and rather than just formal study. But on top of that, my friend Christian/Octo, we're spending our time studying throughout most of our day. And we have other obligations too, but we're just interested into seeing how far we can get within whatever amount of time. And even for someone like him, he even tells me, sort of since he started studying, just his relation, his interest, his fascination with his language just only peaks and peaks and peaks and peaks when these things that you've sort of taken for granted in your entire life, day by day by day, that you've interacted with, these symbols, these sounds, this culture, even just the smallest whiff of comprehension of these things is grossly addicting. And so my study plan, and I don't know how long he intends to study, I believe for the same period as me, before we both will take a trip together to go to both Japan and Korea, is around 16 to 22 months, depending on whether or not we want to go in April or spring. But I just want to say to the future Jace who's looking back on this video, whether it's from 1 week, a month, 6 months, 10 months, 16 months, or 22, I hope you are achieving/have achieved the thing that you want the most. And I look forward to seeing what progress I myself will make, both as someone interacting with myself in this way and as a spectator. So I hope everyone is excited to see the progress of my studies, and hopefully at one point these vlogs will start being in Korean. I will see you next week.